When the whole world congratulated me, my own family threw a celebration for my sister as if I had never existed. That was the moment I knew. I had been dead in their eyes for a long time. I remember that day with painful clarity, the day that should have been my beginning. I held my college acceptance letter in my hand, an acceptance to the school our small town treated like a cathedral of honor. I expected cake, cheers, maybe at least a hug from my mother. Instead, when I stepped into the living room, what hit me were rainbow balloons, candlelight glittering everywhere, and a crowd cheering. For my sister. The cake with someone else's name erased my existence in a matter of seconds. Her name was written in chocolate on white frosting, her smile bright as if the lights were born only to worship her face. I froze, the letter trembling in my pocket. My parents rushed over, but not to hug me. They urged me to jump into a photo with her, so the family looks complete. In my head, something cracked like a gunshot, as if someone had slammed shut a door I would never be allowed to open again. From that second on, I understood. In that house, I was only a shadow. For years after, I tried to live as that shadow. I did well in school, but my grades were never mentioned at the dinner table. I won a small award, but the medal was tucked behind a flower vase, hidden by a photo of my sister in a ball gown. Every time I opened my mouth to share a joy, I was silenced by the same old line. Let your sister finish, your stuff can wait. That sound looped like a prison hymn. Sometimes I imagined disappearing for real. Would anyone even notice? When I turned 18, I decided to disappear in the literal sense. I left home with a small suitcase, a few worn clothes, and the little money I'd saved from odd jobs. No one in my family stopped me. They kept eating dinner while I closed the door softly so I wouldn't disturb the cozy atmosphere I had never belonged to. I heard my sister's laughter echo through the door. It was sweet and sharp like a blade. It sent me out of their lives and into a solitary road. I didn't have much, only stubborn grit. I waited tables, cleaned floors, hauled boxes. My hands cracked, my body ached, but inside me a flame kept burning. Whenever I grew tired, I remembered the way my parents looked at my sister with an adoration that had never once landed on me. The feeling of being swallowed by their indifference hardened into fuel. I promised myself, one day, I'll prove I can rise without their approval. And you know what? That promise wasn't only about proof. It was about revenge. I went to college on student loans and handled everything on my own. Dinners were instant noodles. Winter nights were teeth-chattering when the heater died. I lived on grit, not love. I studied day and night, then found a steady job. I began building a life that had no family in it and didn't need one. Some nights, sitting alone in my tiny apartment, I listened to the wind hiss through the window frame and imagined it as the whisper of justice. Justice for the underdog, for the abandoned child. If you grew up in a family that constantly measured you against someone else, you'll understand. That feeling of never being enough, no matter how hard you try, eats you from the inside out. It turns every achievement into nothing, because you are forever eclipsed by someone labeled perfect. And then you ask yourself, if it were you, could you forgive? Or would you feed that anger until the day you returned for what was owed? I chose the second. And the story you're about to hear is my journey, one paved with blood, tears, and the sweetest revenge I have ever tasted. I didn't know, when I walked out at 18, that the greatest traitor in my life wouldn't be my parents. It would be the sister I once tried to protect. I left a house full of darkness, not knowing that darkness would follow every step I took. The first years away from my family were anything but easy. I lived in a shoebox room where every time I opened the window, the alley's garbage smell poured in. Trucks thundered at midnight, dogs barked without end, neighbors fought through paper-thin walls, and sleep slipped away for weeks at a time. Strangely, I felt more free than I ever had. No orders, no comparisons, no contemptuous glances. My hands blistered from dishwater at the diner, My shoulders throbbed from lifting crates in the warehouse. Grease clung to my hair, my skin, even my sheets. Some nights my shoes were soaked with snow, and I dried them by a wheezing space heater till dawn. But every dollar I earned carried pride. It was mine. No one could take it. I studied while I worked. Late at night, when the building sank into silence, I stayed up with the blue glow of my laptop burning my eyes. Each gust of wind through the window reminded me, this is the price of a new life. And little by little, I climbed. I graduated. I landed my first job. The small ID card clipped to my shirt felt like a medal I'd been denied my entire childhood. Time passed, and I began to believe I could be happy. I met him, the man I once thought was light in my life. He wasn't like anyone I knew. Gentle, attentive, making me feel seen. When I told him about my childhood, he looked at me with sympathy and squeezed my hand. That hand was so warm I thought every wound inside me had finally sealed. We married in a simple ceremony. No parents, no sister, just a few close friends. I didn't feel sad about that. I thought, this is my real family now. Early marriage was sweet as the smell of toast at dawn. I woke early to the soft drip of coffee, feeling each day begin a fresh chapter. We walked in the park together, leaves whispered under our feet like quiet blessings. I believed I had escaped the dark. I believed my life had finally bloomed. But happiness for someone buried long in pain is fragile. When you grow up with betrayal, your instincts never sleep. There were signs, small ones. But I noticed. My sister started reappearing in my life. First were the surprise calls, her voice syrupy as if we'd never drifted apart. Then quick visits, with bright smiles and eyes that roamed over my home. I told myself I was too sensitive. Maybe she truly wanted to mend things. I was wrong. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found them standing close. They laughed at something I couldn't hear. Their eyes met a second too long. In that instant, my chest clenched as if a fist had closed around my heart. I tried to ignore it. I scolded myself for being paranoid. After all I'd been through, maybe I was the one carrying wounds too deep. But trust, once cracked, shatters at the slightest touch. If you've ever felt your past darkness creep back into the things you cherish most, what would you do? Close your eyes and hope it passes? Or track every small sign and wait for the collapse? I didn't know the answer then. I only knew that, while happiness sat within reach, my heart stumbled with a fear I couldn't name. Worse, I felt something familiar. The feeling of being placed outside, pushed out of the light, had returned. I didn't know, when I opened my door to her, that I was inviting a snake into my nest, and it would strike the deadliest bite of my life. I began noticing the little things I once would have missed. Every time she came over, her eyes drifted past me and landed on him. A fleeting brush of fingers, a smile that lingered too long, the way she set a coffee cup beside him instead of me. Piece by piece, those details became shards of glass slicing into the fragile skin of my trust. I kept telling myself I was imagining it. Childhood neglect had made me skittish. But one night I passed the living room and saw them sitting closer than necessary. Her laugh rang high and clear. He looked at her like the room had narrowed to the two of them. I stood in the dark, a chill skating down my spine. My pulse pounded so hard I feared they would hear it. After that, sleep abandoned me. Whenever his phone lit up, my skin prickled. Once I heard the buzz at midnight. He said it was work email, but I saw the screen's glow on his face, and a quick smile as he read. A smile I had never seen for me. The next day, she dropped by unannounced. When I walked in from the kitchen, she was standing too close to him. They startled when they saw me, then stepped apart. A glass clicked on the table like a silent confession. I said nothing, but a fire climbed up my chest. I watched more closely. I logged every time he left without a word. I clocked how she found excuses to call me, yet her voice brightened oddly when she asked about him. I found long strands of unfamiliar hair on his coat. I saw their eyes dodge each other when I entered, like conspirators bracing for discovery. One afternoon, coming home earlier than planned, I heard whispers from the kitchen. The door was ajar, leaking a weak yellow light and a ripple of stifled laughter. I stood still and listened. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt the intimacy threading through their voices. When I pushed the door, they jolted like guilty thieves. She fled on a flimsy pretext. He pretended to ask about dinner. I smiled, but inside, the last plank of my faith cracked. I knew I couldn't stay blind. If I let it slide, I'd be the fool stumbling through my own home. I had spent a childhood in denial. This time was different. This was the life I built, the happiness I fought for. I wouldn't let anyone take it without a fight. I acted. I bought a tiny camera and hid it in the living room. Desperate, yes. But it was the only way back to the truth. That first night, I watched the blinking feed, heart hammering, waiting for anything to confirm my fear. For days, I saw nothing but ordinary moments. He watched TV, she chatted. Polite distance, nothing more. I scolded myself for going too far, for letting old wounds turn me paranoid. Then one evening, everything changed. I replayed a clip and saw her hand on his forearm. Not an accident. A stroke that lingered, an intimacy without disguise. He didn't pull away. He let it rest, then smiled at her. In that moment, a knife drove straight through my chest. I sat frozen before the screen, ears ringing, breath heavy and ragged. I couldn't look away. The image burned itself into my memory so clearly that every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. Everything I'd trusted, every bit of happiness I'd held, was crumbling. I thought of the day I left my parents' house with a small suitcase at 18. I had believed I'd escaped abandonment, that I would never feel it again. But now, the sister I had once shielded, envied, and suffered over was stealing the man I loved. And he, the one I trusted, was betraying me in the cruelest way. If you were me, what would you do? Close your eyes and swallow it? Or face the truth slapping you in the face? I knew, from that moment on, there was no way back. I couldn't return. And I couldn't forgive. I used to think the truth would arrive like light carving through darkness. When it finally came, it wasn't light. It was a cold blade slicing into flesh. I began checking his phone. At first, harmless work messages. The deeper I dug, the more I found what my heart had known all along. Short texts heavy with subtext. Lines deleted in a hurry, their ghostly traces still in the logs. I read each character like swallowing shards of glass, sharp and merciless. One night, while he slept, I unlocked his phone and found messages that could not be denied. Words thick with intimacy. Secret plans to meet. Emojis he had never sent me. I sat in the dark, the screen's blue light washing my face, revealing red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. It felt like the world was collapsing around me. The next day I looked at her differently. Every gesture, every sentence turned into a clumsy performance. She smiled and asked how I was, but I heard the counterfeit in her voice. When her hand touched my shoulder, my skin burned. I knew, and nothing could undo it. Then came the day the truth stopped hiding. I walked into the living room and found her on the couch, palm resting lightly on her belly. Something in her eyes, an odd radiance I had never seen. I asked simply if there was anything she wanted to share. She smiled, sugar-sweet and vicious, like she knew she had already won. She was pregnant. I looked at him, and the answer was already in his eyes. No one had to speak. I knew that the child in her body could never be mine. Blood roared in my ears, like war drums announcing the battle's start. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, shaking, while my voice came out cold enough that I barely recognized it. I asked him hoarse, "How long?" He said nothing. Silence thick and heavy filled the room, the cruelest confession of all. I turned away and walked to the bedroom, my heart slamming as if it would burst through bone. Every tiny moment returned, the brush of fingers, the stolen glances, the lingering smiles. It all played in slow motion, scene after scene, painting the betrayal I had tried to deny. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the clock tick in the dark. Each second passed like another cut. I thought of the childhood refusals, of parents who put her on a pedestal, of the day I left with a small suitcase. I believed I'd outrun the past. Now the cycle had spun back, meaner than ever. In the morning, the mirror showed a different woman. Swollen eyes, but a blazing stare. I knew I couldn't go on as a victim. I needed to act. I needed to claim justice for myself. I returned to the hidden camera. I watched every clip with a blade's focus. And I got what I needed. His arm wrapped around her shoulders, their intimate smiles, the kind of murmurs I could read lips for even if I couldn't hear. Those images didn't need words to accuse. I saved everything. Videos, texts, the smallest traces. I became a detective in my own home. Night after night, I sat in the dark, the screen's light on my face, feeling like I was digging up a buried skeleton handful by handful. When I had enough, I knew. I was ready. I was no longer the forgotten child, no longer the naive wife who believed pretty promises. I was a survivor, and I would turn my pain into a weapon. If you were me, could you forgive? Could you accept that blood and bedfellow conspired against you? Or would you choose what I chose? Silence, patience, and letting the truth expose itself like an open wound that refuses to scab. I knew from that moment on, everything was just beginning. And the ending wouldn't belong to the traitors. It would belong to me. I once believed that when the truth came out, my parents would finally, just once, stand with me. I was wrong. When the news of her pregnancy spread, my family hurried to arrange a gathering. I went, still nursing a small, flickering hope that they would see my pain. But the moment I stepped into that old house, I knew I was only excess weight. My parents' eyes glowed when they looked at her belly. Their hands soothed the fabric over it, while I stood at the edge like a shadow. Mother said I should be happy for her, that my sister had finally found happiness. She looked at my silence with reproach, as if the fault were mine, not the shameless betrayal in front of us. My father added that what matters is the family being reunited, and I needed to learn to leave the past behind. In that moment, my whole childhood rushed back, the forgotten birthdays, my awards shoved into a corner, the praise reserved only for her. History repeated itself, crueler than ever. Their voices landed like hammer blows, smashing every fragile shard of hope I still held. I didn't argue. I sat there, listening to the roar of laughter, the clinking of glasses. I felt like I was attending a funeral, except the dead person was me. The rich smell of food made me nauseous. The yellow lights smeared across the walls like bruises. I lowered my head, forcing the anger down, my hand under the table clenched so hard my nails bit skin. When I stood to leave, no one stopped me, no questions, no sympathetic glance. I left that house like a stranger, closed the door behind me, and knew I no longer had a family. The divorce was swift, but not easy. He and my sister built a story together, painting me as controlling, jealous, even tyrannical. They said I suffocated him, that I'd envied my sister from childhood and never knew how to love. My parents confirmed every word, nodding as if they'd waited a lifetime to condemn me. In court, I sat and listened to the people who gave me life turn their backs, and I saw him holding her hand beneath the table. My heart shrank, but my face stayed stone. I knew if I broke then, they would win for good. I lost more than I imagined. A chunk of my assets was carved away, and their slander stained my name. I left the courthouse empty-handed, with only the small apartment I still called home. On the way back, wind hissed through the trees, carrying a knife-edge cold. I let it cut in, to feel the price of betrayal. What they didn't know was this. That moment forged me. I was no longer the abandoned child or the betrayed wife. I became a survivor, and survivors never forget. I poured everything into work. Longer hours, new skills, more projects. No more midnight tears, just spreadsheets, reports, contracts. Every paycheck felt like reclaiming a piece of freedom they'd tried to take. I had no family, but I had something else. The strength to stand alone. That strength would be the foundation for everything to come. Call it cold if you want. To me, it was justice. Justice for the underdog, for the discarded daughter, for the woman betrayed. I didn't know when, but I knew this for sure. The day of reckoning would come. News of their wedding hit me like a slap. I was divorced, I was gone, and they turned betrayal into a public festival. The whole town knew. Wedding photos flooded social media, their radiant smiles, their glittering, proud eyes. And in the background, there were my parents, standing with them, proud as if the family had finally produced the perfect couple they'd always dreamed of. I wasn't invited. Of course not. But rumors, images, and whispers reached me every day like a relentless rain. A mutual acquaintance sent a photo of them toasting, his hand resting on her belly. I stared at the picture and felt a hollow open in me, deep, aching, cold. Months later, I heard they were throwing a big party to celebrate the baby. I hadn't planned to go, and then I went. Not to rejoice, but to look my humiliation in the eye, to carve the cost of betrayal into memory. I stepped into a house blazing with light. Wine and sweet candle wax perfumed the air. Music thumped, laughter tangled into loud, messy knots. It looked like a festival, but for me, it was an execution. She stood in the center, belly rounded, face glowing like a queen. People crowded her, congratulating, handing over gifts. He stood beside her, smug-eyed, an arm around her waist like a claim of ownership. And my parents, proud, as if this was the crowning achievement of their lives. I sat in a corner with a glass of water and watched. Crystal light bathed her while I rested in shadow. A spoon tapped a glass. She gave thanks, voice sweet and clear, then slid me a glance. Triumph glittered there, saying without words, "So, who's the real winner now?" I swallowed hard but didn't look away. I let the shame soak in, second by second. I wanted to remember this feeling, so I would never forget why I had to rise. Someone asked why I was alone. I smiled, said I was tired. Inside, I wasn't tired. I was sharper than ever. I studied every gesture, every word, every glance, and I realized they didn't just want happiness. They wanted me buried. When the party ended and people drifted out laughing, I stood and went outside. Night wind knifed my skin, smelling of wet leaves. I drew a deep breath and let the cold seep into muscle and bone. In that cold, a vow formed. This would not be the end. If you've ever sat alone in a crowded room, treated as an extra in your own story, you'll understand. That feeling isn't just pain, it's fire. And I knew that fire would burn everything, even my fear. I left with empty hands, but I carried a promise in my chest. They could laugh today. Tomorrow those smiles would turn to tears. I wouldn't run anymore. I would return, not for validation, but for justice. Justice for me. Justice for the years I was buried in darkness. Time passed. My wounds seemed to scab over, but really they were only covered by a hard shell of coolness. I poured myself into work and refused to drown in the past. Every morning, stepping into the office with polished shoes and a tailored suit felt like walking in armored skin. No one saw the cracks inside, only a strong woman, confident, climbing. I was no longer the girl in a drafty apartment with the wind hissing through the window frame. I had a sleek home, a solid job, an income that turned old hardships into distant memories. I could dine at expensive restaurants, buy things I once only pressed my face against the glass to see. Above all, I had freedom, the thing my family never gave me. But real happiness still dodged me. No matter how high I climbed, I still heard her bitter laugh, still saw his smug gaze, still felt the moment my whole family turned away. The scar in my heart never vanished. It only slept, waiting. And then, the day came. One evening, I sat in a restaurant, celebrating a promotion. I'd reached a place few believed I could, and I allowed myself a small reward. I posted a photo of a red wine glass with a brief caption about my joy. I thought nothing of it, just a moment shared. 2 days later, my phone rang. My mother's name lit the screen. I wasn't going to pick up, but the ringing kept coming, insistently. I answered. Her voice shook, not with emotion, but with desperation. She wanted to see me. The family was in trouble. I sat still and listened to her pleading. She mentioned him, mentioned her, mentioned the baby. She said his job was gone. Debts piled up. They couldn't manage. Each word sounded like an old warped record. The family that had abandoned me now came back because I had made it. I didn't answer right away. I let silence flood the call and listened to my heartbeat thud. After all these years, they remembered I existed, not out of love, but for money. We met at their new house, bigger than the old one, more luxurious, the fruit of money they'd once squeezed out of me. Inside, I found chaos. Toys scattered everywhere, unpaid bills on the table, my parents' faces gaunt with worry. She sat still, eyes evasive. He fidgeted, stripped of his former swagger. They spoke in shaking voices. They needed my help. My father repeated the word family. My mother gripped my hand, eyes pleading. I looked at them and saw the world flipped. Years ago, I had begged them to stand by me, and they turned away. Now they were begging me, and I held the power. A sweetness and bitterness rose together. I wanted to tell them I owed them nothing, that I remembered every time they left me out in the cold. I didn't. I sat and watched, letting them expose their weakness. When I stood to leave, they tried to keep me there. I only gave a thin smile. I said I needed time to think. The truth was, I already had my answer. I didn't need to shout or cry. Silence was refusal enough. On the way home, rain fell hard. I walked and let it wash my face, mixing with messy thoughts. I remembered old parties where I was invisible. I remembered every time I stood outside the circle. Now they were the ones outside, and I was at the center. I knew my moment had come. This wasn't just a chance to say no, it was a chance to strike back. I wouldn't just turn my back, as they had. I would let them taste the humiliation, helplessness, and despair they'd fed me. And I would do it cleanly, so no one could deny it. If you've been trampled, dismissed, betrayed, you know the fierce satisfaction of watching the people who hurt you kneel. It isn't just glee, it's justice, and I was ready to deliver it. I had waited for this a long time, not for cheap gloating, but for justice, slow and sure to arrive. I started with what was lawful. No dirty tricks, no baited traps, only evidence, time, and strategy. First, a folder on my computer. Every file clearly named. Texts, invoices, screenshots, bank statements. Each one a pin in the larger map. I laid them out by timeline. Every line an undeniable proof. I printed a copy, clipped it into a plain binder. It weighed more than any metal. Heavy with truth. Heavy with justice made for me. I called a few close friends, people who knew who I really was. They recorded short video statements, no theatrics, only facts. What they'd seen, heard, experienced. I went to a law office. The attorney skimmed the file, nodded, sighed, said everything was clear. Each word split the air like an axe. My life felt a little lighter. The plan wasn't just court. I wanted the truth seen in daylight, not out of spite, but so they couldn't pretend. So neighbors, friends, and old cheerleaders would know who they were. I worked with a journalist friend. A small piece, no hype, just facts. Financial records, proof of the affair, patterns of exploitation. I handed over everything. They verified. They wrote in a steady voice. No drama, only cold data. The article dropped on a Monday morning. My screen lit up at once. Texts, calls, emails surged like floodwater. People read. They were angry. They were indignant. They shared. My parents called. Not to beg or weep this time. They were furious at being exposed. They said I'd done something wrong. They forgot they had chosen silence before. Some old friends avoided me. A few went quiet online. The proud couple, once striding, now stumbled. Apologies appeared in their words, but not repair. Sorry cannot erase evidence. Court became the next crucible. They filed responses. They inflated small details, tried to spin the crowd, but I was ready. Every claim met a counterclaim. Every lie met a document. I stood in the courtroom without shouting. I let my eyes speak. I saw embarrassment flicker in theirs. My attorney was calm, pressing each exhibit. The judge turned pages like calendar leaves. Truth, late but solid, stood its ground. The ruling leaned my way. Not vengeance in criminal terms, but a fair settling. The court found their past accusations baseless. It struck down several absurd payments. I exhaled as if a sandbag slid off my back. But social justice goes beyond verdicts. After the article and the case, their lives changed. Those who once applauded now avoided. Dinner invites and friendly calls dried up. They were no longer welcomed like before. I didn't brag about it. I didn't need praise. There was a moment, though, when my mother met my eyes and looked startled. Maybe she had never imagined I could stand here. She had known me. Now she saw me. My revenge wasn't a scream. It was a sequence of planned steps. A quiet reclaiming of power. A cutting of safety nets. A forcing of consequences. Some say revenge leaves you empty. They say justice shouldn't be a life's goal. But I know myself. I didn't act out of blind hate. I acted to stop being a victim, so no one else would bleed the way I did. After court, I withdrew for a while. Not to hide, to reflect. I walked the park and listened to leaves fall. Cold wind brushed my face awake. Edges softened. A small peace crept in. I didn't wish for their total ruin. I wanted them to understand that actions have consequences, that their choices hadn't only hurt me, they altered an entire course of life. Do you know the strangest thing? When people are stripped of pretense, they scramble for excuses. They build walls of reasons, blame circumstances, pressure, mistakes. But the truth stays simple. They chose. My life didn't become a fairy tale. I didn't get rich overnight. But I found my path again. I slept better. I ate breakfast without dread. I smiled, and the smile was real. Some nights I played the old clips, moments of their happiness that once killed me. Now I watched without bitterness. I saw two tired people. I saw consequences written on their faces. And I realized the sweetest revenge wasn't their pain. It was my good life. The day I walked into the office with a new title, someone snapped a photo. It spread. People called me by my name, not by the label of an old scandal. They saw an independent woman, a model for someone who once felt weak. I received one message, not from family, but from an old friend. Just a line. Thank you for teaching us not to stay silent. That was the greatest reward. Not money, not titles. Knowing my pain could become someone else's strength. In the end, I returned to the small apartment I once called home. I opened the door and drew a slow breath. Coffee lingered from morning. Sunlight fell across the first canvas I ever hung. I sat down, unhurried, and smiled. Justice doesn't arrive by magic. It arrives by patience, strategy, and stubborn will. When you've been abandoned, you can live as a victim forever. Or you can give yourself the chance to rise. I chose to rise, and today, looking back, I know it was right. If you're hearing this and feel buried, remember, you're not alone. There is justice. And sometimes, justice needs someone brave enough to wait.